I want to tell you something that I still can't fully explain. Not because it's complicated, not because the words aren't there, but because every time I start to say it out loud, my throat does this thing, this small, involuntary clench, like my body still remembers what it felt like to be seconds away from death. Her hand was around my throat. Not metaphorically, not in some dramatic, poetic sense. Literally. Her fingers cold as the inside of a freezer, cold in a way that didn't feel like skin at all, cold in a way that made me think of deep space and winter rivers and the underside of stones, wrapped around my neck, and she squeezed. And I looked into her eyes. That's the part people don't ask about. They ask about the teeth usually, or the speed, or what she looked like. But nobody asks what it felt like to look into her eyes in that moment. Because here's what I saw. She wasn't angry. She wasn't frenzied. She wasn't some feral, blood-drunk creature acting on instinct. She was deliberate. She was calm in the way that only something very old can be calm, the kind of calm that comes from having done difficult things so many times that difficulty stops registering. She was looking at me the way you look at a problem that has a clear, obvious solution. The solution was my death. And I remember thinking, even with my vision going gray at the edges, even with the blood pressure building behind my eyes, I remember thinking, she's not wrong. By her logic, she's not wrong at all. That thought probably saved my life. Not because it made her stop. She didn't stop because of anything I thought. She stopped because of something else entirely, something that happened in the next 14 seconds that I'll get to, I promise. But the thought mattered, because it was the first time I'd ever genuinely tried to understand the perspective of something that was actively trying to kill me. And everything that came after, every food package left outside my door, every time I came home to find something I desperately needed sitting on my threshold like a quiet apology, it all started with that thought. It started with me trying to understand her instead of just surviving her. Set up the world outside the window. Let me back up. Let me give you the world as it was then, because context matters and because you need to understand what kind of world allows a moment like that to happen. This was 4 years after integration. If you're old enough to remember pre-integration, you know what I mean when I say the world shifted in ways that nobody, not the government, not the scientists, not the conspiracy theorists who'd been right about everything and still somehow seemed surprised, nobody was fully prepared for. The sky didn't change. The geography didn't change. The physics stayed mostly intact, which was honestly the most reassuring thing anyone could say in those first weeks. But the world changed anyway. Because it turned out that the stories, not all of them, but more of them than was comfortable, were pointing at something real. The vampires had been here long before us, or alongside us, and this was the interpretation that made the most theological and anthropological headaches, they had become what they were because of us, some long-ago divergence that human memory compressed into myth, and then into fiction, and then into entertainment. They weren't interested in being entertainment anymore. The integration accords gave them legal personhood in 43 countries. Not citizenship. That was a separate, ongoing, deeply contentious conversation, but personhood. Rights. The right to exist without being hunted, which had apparently been a real and ongoing concern, even into the 21st century, that most humans had zero awareness of. In exchange, they agreed to certain things: disclosure of population numbers, registration in certain territories, and the one that caused the most controversy on both sides, the blood protocols. I worked for the Bureau of Transitional Species Affairs, BTSA. We called it the Bureau, or sometimes, in tired moments, the mess. My job, my specific, unglamorous, under-budgeted job, was case assessment. I reviewed integration compliance cases. I wrote reports. I sat in rooms with fluorescent lighting that was always slightly the wrong temperature, and I read files about incidents, and I made recommendations. It was, in theory, a desk job. In practice, the integration was not proceeding as smoothly as anyone wanted to believe, and desk jobs had a way of becoming field situations with very little warning. The city I was stationed in, I'll call it the Eastern Sector, which is what we called it internally because the formal name had been changed 3 times in 2 years, and nobody could agree on the final version, was a transition zone, mixed habitation. About 40,000 registered vampires living alongside approximately 2 million humans in a sprawling, ugly, complicated urban sprawl that had once been a perfectly ordinary Midwestern city and had since become the most watched integration experiment on the continent. It was raining the night she tried to kill me. Of course it was raining. Certain moments insist on weather that matches them, as though reality has a sense of drama. The rain in the Eastern Sector had a particular quality. The cloud cover that settled over transition zones, something to do with the atmospheric adjustments that came with high concentrations of vampiric activity. The scientists were still arguing about the mechanism, made the rain come down slow and heavy and almost warm, like it couldn't decide whether it wanted to be fog, like it was embarrassed to be precipitation. I had been working late. I'd been working late every night for 3 weeks because there was a case. I'll call it Case 7 Nova, which was its file designation, that was becoming a problem. Case 7 Nova involved a registered vampire named Seraphine Voss, and the reason it was becoming a problem was that Seraphine Voss was not, by any measurable standard, complying with the blood protocols. She wasn't the violent kind of non-compliant. That would have been simpler. Violent non-compliance went to enforcement, and enforcement had people with considerably more authority and considerably more body armor than I had. Seraphine Voss's non-compliance was political. She was old, the registration file had estimated 300 years, though the Bureau's lead researcher had told me quietly that she thought the estimate was low by at least a century, and she had opinions, strong ones, about the Accords, about what the Accords represented, about what it meant to have survived 3 centuries of being hunted and persecuted and forced into shadows, only to arrive at a world that offered you legal personhood with one hand and a registration number with the other. I understood her position, in the way that you can understand something intellectually while also knowing that your job requires you to handle it in a specific way. She had been speaking publicly, rallying. There were meetings, I had surveillance reports, carefully obtained, in which she was addressing rooms full of vampires who were, to use the enforcement team's phrasing, not in the compliance-optimistic demographic. Young, angry, old enough to remember pre-integration but not old enough to have Seraphine's complicated relationship with patients. My job was to write the case assessment, to determine whether her activities constituted a compliance violation or whether they were protected speech under the personhood provisions of the Accords, to make a recommendation about next steps. My recommendation had been, for 3 weeks, that we should open a dialogue, that someone should meet with her, that the Bureau needed to understand what she actually wanted before we started treating her like a threat. My supervisor had been, for 3 weeks, not loving this recommendation, but also not formally rejecting it, which meant I was stuck in a loop of revising and resubmitting, while the case stayed open, and the enforcement team got increasingly impatient. I was thinking about this as I walked home. I walked home from the office most nights. The transit situation in the Eastern Sector was what you'd call evolving, and I lived close enough that walking was faster than waiting for a hover shuttle that might or might not arrive. It was about 20 minutes through streets that were lit unevenly. The old streetlight grid and the new bioluminescent infrastructure the city had installed post-integration weren't fully integrated yet, and through neighborhoods that were, depending on the block, quiet or loud or something in between. I knew the route. I'd walked it hundreds of times. I didn't notice her until I turned onto Kellerman Street, which was the second to last street before my building, and she stepped out of an alley entrance approximately 8 feet in front of me. My first thought, embarrassingly, was tall. She was tall in a way that read as slightly wrong, not gigantic, not movie monster gigantic, but tall the way certain old buildings are tall, like height that had been accumulated rather than assigned. She was wearing dark clothing that was neither costume nor uniform but something in between, practical and old-fashioned at the same time, and her hair was dark and pulled back and her face was, I registered this even in that first second, extraordinarily composed. She looked at me and I looked at her, and in the half-second of stillness that preceded everything else, I had time to think, I know who this is. Because I'd looked at her registration photo approximately 400 times in 3 weeks. Seraphine Vos. Build tension, the 14 seconds. She moved fast. That's the thing about vampiric speed that you can read about in 100 integration-era explainers and still not be prepared for. It's not like fast human movement. It's not like watching an athlete sprint. It's more like a discontinuity. Like reality briefly skipped a frame. She was 8 feet away and then she was there, and her hand was at my throat. Not squeezing yet, just there, holding, a statement of capability rather than intent. "You're the one writing the reports," she said. Her voice was low and even, accented in a way I couldn't place, something European, something old, something that had been shaped by languages I'd probably never heard spoken. "Yes," I said. Which was, looking back, I'm almost proud of this, the correct answer. Not what reports, which would have been insulting. Not I don't know what you're talking about, which would have been a lie she'd have detected in a heartbeat. Just yes. Just acknowledging reality, because there was no universe in which denying it helped me. "You've been building a case." "I've been assessing a situation," I said. "Those aren't the same thing." Something shifted in her eyes, not warmly, but it shifted. "You recommended dialogue," she said. "It wasn't a question." I didn't ask how she knew that. I suspected she had sources inside the Bureau. It wouldn't have surprised me, given how many integration-era staff were what the internal terminology called sympathetically adjacent to registered vampire interests. I didn't ask because asking would have been a deflection, and we both knew I didn't have time for deflections. "Yes," I said again. "Why?" Not a question either. A demand. The kind of demand that old things make not rude, not aggressive, just devoid of the social lubrication that humans use to soften demands into questions. Just, tell me your reasoning and do not waste my time. And here's where the thought happened, the thought I mentioned at the beginning. I looked at her, her hand still loose around my throat, the cold of her skin seeping through my collar, and I thought, she's not wrong. By her logic, she's not wrong at all. Because I'd read the file. I'd read the registration file and the historical cross-references and the supplementary documentation that the Bureau's archivist had pulled. Not because it was relevant to my case assessment, strictly speaking, but because I'm the kind of person who reads everything, and I knew a little bit about what 3 centuries looks like from the inside. 300 years of hiding, of moving, of watching your kind get hunted by people who were afraid of you, people who'd made you into a monster in their stories so they didn't have to feel bad about killing you. 300 years of surviving, of developing the kind of patient, undeceivable intelligence that comes from needing to read every room you walk into before deciding whether it's safe. And now she was standing in a world that had said, "We acknowledge you exist," and in the same breath said, "Here is your number. Here are your protocols. Here is the framework within which you are permitted to continue existing," and she was supposed to be grateful for it. She was supposed to comply enthusiastically and stop making speeches that made enforcement teams nervous. By her logic, she wasn't wrong to be angry. By her logic, a Bureau case assessor walking home alone at night was a reasonable opportunity to make a point about what happened when the Bureau's reports led somewhere she didn't want them to lead. I understood all of this in a second and a half. Because you're right, I said. She went still, not the stillness of someone who stopped moving, she'd been still already, a deeper stillness, something that happened behind the eyes. The accords are flawed, I said, because I'd started and I might as well finish. The registration system treats personhood like a conditional offer. The compliance framework was written by people who were afraid of you, and fear makes bad legislation. You're not wrong to say so. You're not wrong to organize. What I recommended dialogue for was because I thought, and I still think, that if someone in the Bureau actually listened to what you're trying to say instead of writing threat assessments about it, there might be a way to make the compliance conversation go better for everyone. A long pause. The rain came down, heavy and warm and embarrassed to be rain. You believe that, she said. Yes. You're not saying it to stay alive. I thought about lying. The thought lasted approximately 1/3 of a second before I discarded it. I'm saying it to stay alive and I believe it. Both things are true. The overlap doesn't make either of them false. Something happened then, something I still don't have a clean word for. The hand at my throat didn't tighten, it released. Not quickly. Not dramatically. Slowly, the way you'd set down something fragile, the way you'd back away from the edge of something you'd almost stepped over. She stepped back. She looked at me for a moment that felt long, and was probably 4 seconds. Go home, she said. And I did. The weeks after, what I didn't tell the Bureau. I walked the rest of the way to my building with very steady legs, which I was quietly proud of, and I got into the elevator and I pressed the button for the 7th floor, and I stood there with my hands clasped in front of me, not shaking, and I thought about what I was going to do. What I did not do, file a report about the encounter. I want to be clear that this was a serious professional violation. An encounter with a subject of an open case assessment, outside of official channels, without witnesses, involving physical contact and an implicit threat. This was exactly the kind of thing that the Bureau's incident reporting protocols were designed for. I was required to report it within 24 hours. I absolutely should have reported it. I wrote the report 3 times. I deleted it 3 times. On the 3rd deletion, I sat back in my desk chair at 2 a.m. and I looked at my ceiling and I asked myself, as honestly as I could, why I was deleting it. The honest answer was, because I didn't think she'd actually meant to kill me. I know how that sounds. She had her hand around my throat. She had released it in a way that suggested the decision had been genuinely close. That's not a threat. But I'd looked at her eyes the whole time, and what I'd seen was a test. Not a murder attempt, a test. She'd wanted to know what I was, not physically, not even professionally. She'd wanted to know what I was underneath the title and the case file and the Bureau affiliation, whether there was a person in there who was capable of seeing her as something other than a compliance problem. Filing the report would have proven her wrong about that. So I didn't file it. I finished my case assessment. I submitted a revised version that I'd been working on for a week, the one that recommended, more forcefully than any previous version, that the Bureau open formal dialogue with the organized vampire community around the registration concerns rather than treating organized activity as inherently threatening. I cited 3 integration scholars. I cited 2 of her speeches, obtained through the surveillance reports, and I characterized them as substantive political critique rather than incitement. My supervisor called me into her office and looked at my report for a long time and said, "You're asking me to stick my neck out." "I'm asking you to do your job," I said, which was not diplomatic but was accurate. She submitted the report. 2 weeks later, I found something outside my apartment door. The first package. It was morning. I was leaving for work 7:15, the time I always left, a habit so regular it was practically pathological, and I almost stepped on it. A paper bag, Brown, the kind you see in old markets, not the synthesized disposable kind that most stores use now. Folded down at the top with two neat folds. No label, no note. I stood in my doorway for a long time, looking at it. I was aware that it could be a threat. The Eastern Sector was a complicated place, and I had a complicated job, and there were people, human people, not just vampires, who weren't happy about integration sympathetic case assessments. I had the building's security system. I could have called someone. Instead, I picked it up and brought it inside and unfolded it on my kitchen counter. Inside, a container of soup. The kind you get from the old-style restaurants in the Eastern Sector's historical district, the ones that had been running since before integration and didn't use automated preparation. Handmade dumplings in a broth I'd never smelled before, something herbed, something with a warmth to it that wasn't quite any flavor I could name, sealed with a pressed lid. Still warm. I stood in my kitchen with the container in my hands, and I thought about who could have left it. The building had decent security, not bureau level, but decent. The corridors were monitored. Getting to the 7th floor required either a resident key or a visitor login at the front desk. Neither of those would have stopped Seraphine Voss. I ate the soup. I don't know why that feels like it needs justifying, but let me say, I ate it because I was hungry and it smelled extraordinary, and because some part of me, the part that had looked into her eyes and seen a test, not a murder attempt, had already decided that whatever this was, it wasn't poison. It was the best soup I'd ever had. The pattern. It didn't happen every day. That's important to understand. If it had happened every day, it would have been easier to analyze. Patterns are comforting. They give you something to work with. Instead, it was unpredictable. 3 days in a row and then nothing for a week. Then twice in one day, once in the morning and once late at night. Then a gap of 10 days that I found myself tracking with an awareness I wasn't entirely comfortable with. Then 2 mornings in a row again. It was always food. Always from the historical district restaurants. I started recognizing the containers, the particular pressed lid style of Korova's Deli, the distinctive dark paper of the place on 7th and Halloran that didn't have a name on its sign and never had. Always extraordinary. Always the kind of thing that someone would have to know you'd want. Which was what started to unsettle me. Because I'm not particularly demonstrative about my food preferences. I don't make a big show of what I eat or what I like. But there was a pattern in the packages, a pattern in what she brought, that was uncomfortably accurate. The nights I'd worked late, I'd come home to something substantial. The mornings when the weather was worst, there'd be something warm. There was one particular package, left on a Tuesday evening, that contained the specific kind of bread I'd mentioned in passing, to a colleague at lunch, 6 days earlier, that I hadn't been able to find since a bakery in my old neighborhood had closed. I don't know how she knew about that. I still don't know. I ate the bread and I sat at my window and I watched the slow, embarrassed rain, and I thought, she is watching me. Not in the way that felt threatening. In the way that felt like, and I'm aware this sounds like the most naive possible interpretation, but stay with me. In the way that felt like someone who was used to watching, because watching was how she kept the people she decided mattered safe. 300 years of surviving, of reading every room. She had decided something about me. I wasn't sure what yet. The second encounter, the research station. I need to tell you about the research station, because it's where things began to make more sense. The Bureau had a secondary facility, not a secret, just not advertised, in the lower levels of the Eastern Sector. We called it the Archive, though its official designation was Transitional Integration Research Station 7, TIRS 7. It was where the Bureau kept its most sensitive historical documentation, the pre-integration records, the oral history collections from the first generation of registered vampires, the genetic and physiological research that had been conducted with consenting subjects, and that remained, for obvious privacy reasons, restricted access. I had access, not broad access, but enough. I had started going there in the evenings, after the official hours, because the caseload had shifted in a way that made historical context suddenly very relevant. The dialogue initiative I'd recommended had been approved, tentatively, conditionally, with 17 qualifications, and there was now an official working group tasked with reviewing the registration system. I'd been assigned to support it, which meant I needed to understand, better than I currently did, the actual history of vampire-human interaction in the eastern sector. The archive was in the sublevels. You got to it through a service corridor that connected to the Bureau's main building through an underground walkway, and the whole route was monitored and secured. It was the kind of place that felt like it existed outside of regular time. No windows, controlled lighting, climate management that kept everything at preservation temperature. It smelled like old paper, and something chemical, and something underneath both of those that I had no name for. I was there late on a Thursday when I heard someone else in the stacks. The archive closed at 6. I was there at 9:30 under a researcher's after-hours access provision. No one else was supposed to be in the building. I went still. I did not go for the emergency communicator on my wrist, which I probably should have. Instead, I listened. Footsteps, slow, careful, even, moving along one of the parallel stacks, the section that held the pre-integration oral histories, the recorded testimonies that the Bureau's predecessor organization had collected in the decade before the Accords. I moved toward the sound. Again, not the defensively optimal choice. I make no claims about my self-preservation instincts. She was standing at a shelf, reading. Not holding a book, she'd apparently just come to this specific point in this specific aisle to read the spine of a specific archive box. She didn't look up when I stopped at the end of the row. "How did you get past the security system?" I said. "The security system is designed for humans," she said. "It assumes certain things about movement and heat signatures and the time it takes to traverse a space." "Right," I said. A pause. She hadn't looked at me yet. "Why are you here?" I said. "I could ask you the same thing." "I'm a Bureau researcher with after-hours access. I have documentation." "I know." She finally looked at me. In the archive lighting, dim, warm, archive-appropriate, her eyes were a color I hadn't registered clearly the first time. Not dark, something more complex. I wanted to see the testimonies. The oral histories. The oral histories. She looked back at the archive box. I gave 3 of them in the early collection period. I was not using my real name. Something shifted in my chest, a reordering of assumptions. "You wanted to know what you'd said," I said. "I wanted to know what they'd done with what I'd said." A pause. "I wanted to know if any of it had been passed on to the people making decisions." I thought about the 17 qualifications on the approved dialogue initiative. I thought about the enforcement team's impatience. I thought about the threat assessment language that the Bureau's standard reports used, and that I'd been, slowly, over 3 weeks and multiple revisions, trying to move away from. "Some of it has been," I said. "Not enough of it, but some." She was quiet for a moment. "You submitted a revised framework for the working group," she said. "The one that recontextualizes organized community activity as civil participation rather than compliance risk. You have very good sources." "I have 3 centuries of experience cultivating good sources." Not quite a smile, something in the same neighborhood. It was a well-reasoned framework. "Thank you." "I'm not paying you a compliment," she said. "I'm observing that it was accurate. Compliments suggest a relationship that we don't have." "Don't we?" I said. And then, because I'd apparently decided this was the night for reckless honesty, "You've been leaving food outside my door for 6 weeks." Another pause, longer. "You needed to eat," she said finally. I eat on a regular basis. You eat badly. You leave the office at irregular hours. You skip meals when the case load is heavy. She stopped, seemed to reconsider the sentence. You are a person who neglects himself when he is focused on something else. I didn't know what to do with that. In the absence of an appropriate response, I said, "The bread, from the bakery on Keswick Avenue. How did you know about that?" A pause that felt different from the others, almost something human in it. "Because I used to pass that bakery every morning for 11 years, she said, "before they closed, because the smell of it, the specific smell of that bread, was something that I associated with another stop, another reconsideration. I recognized it when you mentioned it. I know someone who bakes the same way, the same recipe." We were both quiet for a moment. "The soup," I said, "the first package." "What about it?" "It was extraordinary." Something happened in her expression. Not a smile, I want to be precise about this, but something that a smile might eventually grow out of, given sufficient time. The precursor to warmth, the geological layer beneath warmth. "My grandmother's recipe," she said, "adapted." "Your grandmother?" "She died in 1743, said without drama. As a fact among facts. I stood in the archive aisle with the climate-controlled air pressing gently against my face, and I thought about what it meant to carry a recipe for 300 years, to still adapt it, to give it to someone because they needed to eat, and you recognized something in them that made you want them to continue existing. "Thank you," I said, "for the food, all of it." She looked at me for a moment. Then she reached for the archive box she'd come to read, and she pulled it carefully from the shelf, and she said, "There's a reading table in the south corner. Better lighting." And I followed her to the reading table. We stayed there until 2 in the morning, reading different things in the same silence, and when I left she was still there. And when I came back the next evening, the security log showed no record of her presence. I need to explain the situation with the rally before I explain what happened at it. The working group had been meeting for 2 months. The dialogue initiative, despite the 17 qualifications and the enforcement team's continued impatience, was actually producing results, small ones, provisional ones, the kind of results that you have to look at sideways to see, but real. There was a draft proposal on the table that would create a community liaison position within the Bureau, a formal channel for registered vampires to raise compliance concerns, without those concerns being automatically routed to enforcement. It wasn't enough. Everyone knew it wasn't enough, but it was something. Seraphine Voss had been part of the community input process, officially, through proper channels, which was itself a significant shift. She had attended 2 of the working group's community sessions. She had been precise, unsentimental, and exhaustingly well documented in everything she said. The enforcement team was still nervous about her. I had written 2 separate internal memos explaining why their nervousness was not a case assessment basis for anything. Then someone leaked the draft proposal. Not the whole thing. A specific clause, a clause that dealt with the conditions under which compliance concerns could be escalated to enforcement review, was leaked with enough deliberate mischaracterization that, by the time it spread through the community networks, it read like the entire dialogue initiative was a mechanism for better targeted enforcement rather than what it actually was. The rally was organized within 48 hours. I heard about it through my sources, who heard about it through their sources, which meant I heard about it approximately 12 hours before it happened, which was not enough time to do anything useful officially. My supervisor was in an emergency coordination meeting with the enforcement team. The working group was scrambling. Nobody had a clear read on what the rally would look like, or whether it would stay within the parameters that the public gathering provisions of the Accords permitted. I went. I know, I understand that this was not a sanctioned Bureau activity. I went in civilian clothes, without my identification, which is the professional equivalent of putting your fingers in your ears and humming, since I was still a bureau employee regardless of what I was wearing. I went because I thought someone who'd been part of the dialogue process should be there as a witness, and because I thought, if I'm being completely honest, that I was less likely to end up in a situation that escalated badly if I was physically present. The rally was in the Kellerman district. Where else? It was large, larger than I'd expected. The estimates I'd seen beforehand had suggested 300 to 400 registered vampires, but the crowd that filled the square was bigger than that, and it wasn't just vampires. There were humans there too, integration advocates, community organizers, some of the historians and researchers who had been working on the oral history project, people who had staked their professional credibility on the argument that the integration could work. The speaking platform was temporary, set up in the center of the square. I positioned myself toward the back, where I had sightlines and a clear exit, which was the closest thing to sensible behavior I managed all evening. Seraphine Voss was the third speaker. I had never seen her speak publicly. I had read transcripts and surveillance summaries, but reading about it hadn't prepared me for the actual experience, which was this. She had 3 centuries of surviving to draw on, and she knew how to use them. Not performance, not rhetoric exactly. She didn't have the cadence of a politician or an orator. She had the cadence of someone telling the truth, and she did it with the particular weight of someone who had learned over a very long time that the truth was worth being careful with. She talked about the leak. She named it as what it was: deliberate mischaracterization, probably sourced from within the Bureau's enforcement division, designed to undermine the dialogue initiative before it could produce meaningful outcomes. She was precise. She was documented. She named clauses and compared them to how they'd been reported. And then she talked about what integration actually needed to mean. Not the legal framework, not the compliance protocols. The underneath of it, the philosophical bedrock that had to be there for any of the legal and procedural stuff to mean anything. She said, you cannot integrate with something you are afraid of. You can manage it. You can regulate it. You can build frameworks that allow it to exist in your spaces while you tell yourself you've solved the problem. But integration, actual integration, the kind that lasts, the kind that produces something better than what either group had alone, requires that you stop being afraid. Not because the thing you're afraid of is harmless, but because you've done the work of understanding it. Because you've looked at it clearly and you know what it actually is, not what your fear tells you it is. She paused. I tried to kill someone 6 months ago, she said. A bureau employee. He was building a case file and I wanted to know what kind of person was behind it. My heart did something complicated. He looked me in the eye while my hand was at his throat and he told me I wasn't wrong. He told me the framework I was being asked to comply with was flawed, that fear makes bad legislation, that he wanted dialogue because he thought dialogue would produce better outcomes for everyone. She paused. He was telling me the truth. I could tell, and he knew that I could tell, and he told me anyway. The crowd was very quiet. I want to ask the Bureau something, she said. Not as a demand, as a genuine question. How many people do you employ who are willing to do that? Who are willing to look at us, at what we actually are, not at what 3 centuries of fear has told you we are, and tell us the truth about what they see? Because that is the person we need to be building this with. That is the architecture that integration requires. She stepped back from the platform. I stood in the back of the crowd with my hands in my pockets and I thought, she just told approximately 1,000 people what happened in that alley. She didn't name me, but she described the moment accurately enough that anyone who'd been watching Case 7 Nova closely could work it out. She told 1,000 people the story of a moment she could have used as a demonstration of power, as evidence that the Bureau's case assessors were within reach, were vulnerable, were not as untouchable as they thought they were, and she used it instead as an argument for trust. I needed some air. She found me outside the square, on a side street, sitting on a low wall and looking at my hands. "You're here," she said, not accusatory, observational. "Yes." "You heard." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, standing a few feet away, not entirely unlike the way you stand near something you're not sure how to approach. "I didn't name you," she said. "I know, thank you. You should probably file a report about the alley, at some point, before someone else connects it." "I know," I looked up at her. "Did you mean what you said about the architecture of integration?" "I don't say things I don't mean. It wastes time." "Right," I thought for a moment. "The food is going to have to stop," I said, "professionally. If this gets any more complicated, someone is going to start asking questions about my objectivity, and I can't give them a reason." Something moved in her expression, just briefly. "The working group," she said. "Yes." "The community liaison position." "The draft is still on the table. The enforcement team isn't happy about the rally, but the leak is now a documented concern, and there's an internal review which is going to buy time." I looked at her. "It might actually work." "Some version of it." She was quiet for a moment. "That would be something," she said. "Yes." Another pause, longer. "There's a Korova's location in the North Quarter," she said. "Better dumplings than the one near your office." "Good to know," I said, because I didn't know what else to say. "You should go there occasionally, before it closes. These things close." "Your grandmother's soup," I said. She looked at me for a moment. Something in the expression that I'd been watching for weeks now, waiting for it to complete itself, finally came close to resolving. Not quite. 3 centuries is a long time to learn caution, but close. "I'll send you the recipe," she said, "eventually." And then she was gone. Not dramatically, she didn't vanish in a theatrical way. She turned and walked back toward the square, and the crowd absorbed her. And I sat on the low wall for a while longer in the slow, warm rain, thinking about what it meant for someone to go from trying to end your life to offering you their grandmother's recipe. I thought, it means they looked at you and decided you were worth keeping. I thought, that's not a small thing. That might be the least small thing that's happened to me. I'm going to tell you some of what I learned about her in the months that followed. Not from the bureau file. That file had its version of her, which was accurate in the way that census data is accurate, technically and completely inadequately. I learned it from the archive. From the oral testimonies she'd given under a different name in the early collection period. From the documents she eventually, and this was a carefully negotiated, formally structured process, allowed the historical record to use. Seraphine Voss was not her original name. Her original name was in a language that hadn't been spoken in conversational European society since the mid-1700s. She'd acquired Seraphine through a period in early 18th century Paris, and Voss through another period in Germany 2 generations later. She'd gone through names the way generations go through fashions, not carelessly, but because staying in one place long enough for a name to become a liability was a kind of luxury she'd rarely been able to afford. She'd been turned in 1623. She'd been a midwife. I want to let that sit for a moment because I think it matters. She'd been someone whose entire professional existence was about bringing life into the world, about the threshold between not being and being. And then something had happened at that threshold that she'd never described in detail in any testimony I found. She'd survived it. She'd emerged from it with 3 centuries ahead of her and a choice about what to do with them. What she'd done with them was this: she'd kept watching. The testimonies described decade after decade of it. She'd watched civilizations build and collapse. She'd watched the specific horror of being hunted, not abstractly, not historically, but personally. She'd lost people. The testimonies were careful and precise, and almost entirely unemotional in the way that extreme emotion sometimes goes underground and comes out as precision. She'd been in the Eastern sector for 40 years. She'd arrived before integration, when what was now called the Eastern Sector was just a city, when the underground vampire community there was small and very careful and very quiet. She'd helped organize it. She'd helped people survive. And when integration came, she'd been the one in the room who said, "I don't trust this." Not because it's not better than what came before, but because better is not good enough, and we should not be grateful for something that is merely better when what we are owed is justice. That position had made her difficult. I'd known that from the Bureau file. I hadn't known, until I read the testimonies, how much of her difficulty came not from anger but from grief. From 40 years of watching people, she'd spent decades keeping safe suddenly being visible in a world that still wasn't entirely sure it wanted them to be. She wasn't trying to burn integration down. She was trying to make it mean what it was supposed to mean. The food continued differently. The food continued. I want to be clear about that, because I said it would stop, and it did stop, in the form it had been taking, but it transformed into something else. The Korova's recommendation became a weekly thing, not formally scheduled, not planned in any way that either of us would have acknowledged if asked. But on Tuesday evenings, the Korova's in the North Quarter was where I had dinner, and approximately 6 out of every 10 Tuesday evenings, she was there. We didn't sit together immediately. The first few times, she was simply present, at a table on the other side of the restaurant, and we acknowledged each other with the kind of nod that doesn't require explanation. The third time, she moved her tea to my table when my food arrived. "The soup is better here," she said. "Is it? Try it." I tried it. She was right. Conversations developed. Slowly, the way things develop when both parties have good reasons for caution. She asked me about the working group. I asked her about the community concerns she was hearing. It was professional before it was personal, which felt right, felt like the correct order for two people who'd started their relationship with her hand at my throat. But it became personal, eventually. She told me about the recipe, about her grandmother who had been human, which surprised me, and which she said she wasn't surprised that it surprised me, since the Accord-era discourse had been frustratingly binary about the question of family. She told me about Paris, not all of it, selective archaeology, the kinds of details you share when you're deciding how much to share. I told her about why I'd gone into transitional affairs work. About my grandmother, actually, human, alive. A woman who had grown up in a community that had made it very clear it didn't want her kind there, and who had nevertheless stayed and built something and raised people who understood that integration was something you constructed rather than something that happened automatically. "She sounds like someone I would have liked," Seraphine said. "She would have asked you 1,000 questions," I said. "She wouldn't have been afraid of you." "That's the second rarest quality I've encountered in 400 years, she said. "The first is someone who is not afraid and also asks good questions." I thought about that for a moment. "What's the assessment on me?" I said. She looked at me across the table. Something settled in her expression, something that had been working its way toward resolution for months. "You ask better questions than most," she said. "I have to tell you about the incident at the Bureau because it changed things, and because it explains a part of what came next that doesn't make sense without it." 6 months after the rally, the community liaison position was formally approved. Not in the exact form the working group had proposed. There were modifications, concessions, the usual compromise-shaped outcomes of anything involving multiple institutional stakeholders and 17 qualifications. But it was real. There would be a formal channel. The Enforcement Division was not happy. The Enforcement Division had been not happy for a long time, and their not happiness had been accumulating. And when the community liaison position was approved, something shifted in their internal calculation. Someone filed an inquiry. Not about the dialogue initiative. About me. Specifically about Case 7 Nova and the question of whether my case assessment had been conducted with appropriate objectivity, given what the inquiry described as potential undisclosed contact with the case subject. I didn't know who filed it. I still don't know. It was anonymous, which was permitted under Bureau protocol, which I had always thought was a good policy and was less enthusiastic about in the moment. I was called to a review panel, standard process. I prepared my documentation, all of it except the alley, which I had indeed never reported, and I sat in front of 3 panel members, and I told them the truth about every documented contact I'd had with Seraphine Voss. The review panel took 2 weeks to produce its finding. Their finding was that my case assessment had shown appropriate thoroughness, and that the community dialogue recommendation had been professionally justified. The undisclosed prior contact question. They had, somehow, found the archive footage from TIRS-7, which I had not been aware existed, was noted but determined to be below the threshold for a formal compliance issue, given that the encounter was determined to be non-adversarial. I didn't know, until later, that Seraphine had been aware of the inquiry. I didn't know, until later, that she had provided a voluntary statement to the review panel, in writing, formally, under her registration information, that described the archive encounter and characterized our interactions as consistent with an appropriate professional dialogue. She had put her name on a Bureau document to protect my record. 3 centuries of surviving had involved avoiding Bureau documentation wherever possible. She'd told me that much, and she'd put her name on a document. The recipe. She sent it 2 weeks after the review panel's finding. Not digitally, she didn't use the Bureau's communication channels, for obvious reasons, but through a courier service that operated in the historical district, the old-style kind, which delivered an envelope to my building's front desk. Inside the envelope, a single sheet of paper, handwritten. The handwriting was old-fashioned in a way that you immediately understood was not affectation. It was the handwriting of someone who'd learned to write before standardized fonts, before keyboards, before everything about writing became a mechanical act. The recipe, grandmother's soup, the specific broth, 3 different herbs I'd never heard of, which she had helpfully footnoted with their modern common names. The dumplings, the exact ratios, the specific technique for the fold. A note at the bottom in smaller writing. The broth takes longer than you think. Don't rush it. The dumplings can be rushed if necessary. The broth cannot. I read the note several times. I made the soup on a Sunday. It took most of the afternoon. The broth was, as she'd promised, slower than I expected. There was a point, around the 2-hour mark, where I was genuinely uncertain it was going to come together into anything coherent. And then it did. Gradually, the way gradual things happen, not in a moment but across a span of time that you can only appreciate in retrospect. It tasted exactly like the first package. Exactly. I sat at my kitchen table with a bowl of it, and I thought about what she'd carried for 300 years. What it weighed and what it was worth, and why she'd decided I was someone to give it to. I messaged her through the courier service. I didn't know if she'd respond. I wasn't sure of the protocol, wasn't sure if the recipe had been an invitation to further communication or a conclusion. But I messaged her. The broth took 3 hours. You were right that I almost rushed it. I didn't. It was perfect. She responded 2 days later. You should make it again. The second time is better than the first. You'll understand why when you do it. I made it again 6 weeks later. She was right. The second time was better, not because the recipe had changed, but because I'd internalized something about the pace of it. I'd stopped fighting the slowness and let it do what it needed to do. I told her this. That's what 400 years teaches you, she wrote back. The slowness is not an obstacle. The slowness is the process. The community liaison position filled in its first year with someone from the organized community, not Seraphine herself, which I think everyone expected, and she had declined, with characteristic precision, on the grounds that she thought it was important for the position to be held by someone who was not also trying to hold the community organizing space. She'd recommended 3 candidates. The working group had hired the second one, a man named Anatoly who had been in the eastern sector for 60 years and had the particular patience of someone who'd watched a lot of things not quite work out and remained committed to the next attempt. Anatoly was good at the job. He had her rigor without her particular style of controlled intensity, which made him easier for the enforcement team to work with, which she'd probably calculated when she recommended him. The working group's second-year report showed measurable improvements in compliance rates, not because enforcement had become more aggressive, if anything, the reverse, but because the community liaison channel had resulted in a significant number of compliance concerns being addressed before they became violations. People were using the channel. It was, tentatively, working. I wrote the assessment. I was precise. I was thorough. I cited everything. My supervisor read it and said, "This is a good report, Hartwell." That was the highest praise she was capable of. I accepted it accordingly. What she told me about the night in The Alley. We talked about it once, directly. It had been almost a year since the alley, and we were at the Korovas in the North Quarter, and it came up naturally out of a conversation about something else, about risk assessment, I think, and the ways in which the Bureau's frameworks failed to account for the things that mattered most in practice. "I wasn't going to kill you," she said. "I know," I said. "I want you to know that I knew that at the time. It was not a close thing in the way you might have thought. You had your hand at my throat." "Yes, I was." She seemed to choose words carefully, which she did not always do but did when the words mattered. "I was demonstrating that I could." "Which is different from intending to." "Why did you need to demonstrate it?" A pause, the kind she took when the answer was something she'd thought about. "Because I needed you to tell me what you actually thought, not what you thought would keep you safe," she said. "And people tell the truth more readily when the cost of lying is clear." I thought about that. That's a very old approach to gathering information. I've had a very long time to develop it. Something in her expression. "You told me you were afraid and you told me the truth anyway. That's rarer than you know. You said that before, at Korovas, that it was the second rarest quality." "I did. And the first." She looked at me across the table. Something had completed itself in her expression over the course of a year, I realized. The geological layer had finished its process. What was on the surface now was not quite warmth in the human sense, but the version of it that 3 centuries of careful survival had produced, something old and considered and genuine. "The first is rare enough that when I find it I bring soup," she said. The food became something else. I want to be precise about this because it matters. The food had started as a test, I think, or maybe as a version of the thing she'd done for 300 years, watching, assessing, deciding who was worth keeping. She'd watched me walk home late and work too many hours and forget to eat, and she'd made a decision about what she was going to do about it, the way she made decisions, precisely, without announcement, without asking for acknowledgement. But over the year it had become something else, something I don't have a clean category for, which is unusual for me. I work in documentation. I believe in categories. It was a form of trust, maybe, the most specific and personal form I'd ever been offered. Not the trust of "I will tell you things," she was careful about that, even now, in ways I respected, but the trust of "I see you and I want you to continue. I have decided you matter and here is how that decision looks in practice." It looked like soup. It looked like bread from a bakery that reminded her of 11 years of mornings. It looked like a recipe in old-fashioned handwriting with a footnote about the slowness of broth. I had been, in her calculation, something worth keeping, and she'd expressed that the only way you can really express something that fundamental, which is not through language but through care, through the small, repeated act of attending to someone's continued existence. It wasn't really the last, but I think of it as the last because it was the one that said something neither of us had managed to say out loud. It was on a Monday, not a Korovas Tuesday. I came home from an unusually difficult day, 2 escalated cases, a contentious working group session, the kind of day where everything has a sandpaper quality, and I found a package outside my door. A paper bag, brown, folded down with 2 neat folds. Inside, the soup, her grandmother's recipe, made by someone who hadn't cooked it but who clearly knew someone who had. Still warm in the way it was always still warm, which I'd stopped trying to explain. And underneath the soup container, something I hadn't seen before. A second sheet of paper, handwritten in the same old-fashioned script. It said, "You asked me once what it means to have carried something for 400 years. I didn't answer you then because I didn't have an answer I was satisfied with. I have one now. It means that what you carry becomes part of what you are. The weight of it is not a burden if you understand it as structure. The recipe is not mine. It belonged to someone before me, and I made it mine by carrying it carefully, by not losing it, by passing it on when I found someone worth passing it to. There will be a third time you make this. It will be better than the second. SV." I sat at my kitchen table with the soup and the letter and the particular quiet of a Monday evening, and I thought about structure, about the things we carry and what they make us, about the 400 years between someone learning to write and writing a note to leave outside a bureau assessor's door, about what it means when something that tried to end your life decides, instead, that you are worth feeding. What I know now. 4 years since integration. Almost a year and a half since the alley on Kellerman Street. The working group is in its 3rd phase. The community liaison position has expanded. There are now 3 liaisons, covering different areas of the eastern sector, and the model is being piloted in 2 other transition zones on the continent. The enforcement team still makes noise about compliance rates, but the noise has a different quality to it, more procedural, less existential. The conversation has shifted in ways that are hard to quantify, but that you can feel if you've been in the room long enough. I'm still at the bureau. I was offered a senior position last month, broader scope, more resources, more authority to shape the frameworks that determine how integration is assessed and reported. I'm still deciding. I'll probably take it. I've been thinking about this with the particular slowness that broth requires, that the work matters enough to go deeper into it, that there are still enough things broken to be worth the work of fixing. Seraphine Voss is still organizing, still speaking, still precise and documented and rigorous in everything she says. She is also, I've learned, the person who recommended the working group approach the Community Oral History Project as a formal integration document, accessible to the public, not just to bureau researchers, something she'd wanted for years. It was approved last month. We still have dinner at Korovas, not every Tuesday, but most of them. The conversation has the quality of something that has been developing for a long time and knows it still has a long way to go, which is the best quality any conversation can have. Last week she told me about 1743, not all of it, some of it. I asked good questions. Ending. There's a thing that happens sometimes in the bureau when you've been in transitional affairs long enough. You start to see integration not as an event, not as a historical moment that happened 4 years ago, and that the world is now navigating the aftermath of, but as a verb. Something continuous, something that has to be chosen, repeatedly, by people on both sides of every boundary it crosses. Seraphine Voss chose it, I think, in the alley on Kellerman Street. Not when she released my throat before that. When she came to find me at all. When she decided that a bureau case assessor was worth the risk of a direct encounter, that the possibility of a person in the file was worth testing. I chose it when I deleted the report, when I told the truth with her hand at my throat, when I followed her to the reading table in the archive. We choose it every Tuesday at Korova's. The soup is still extraordinary. I've made it 6 times now. She was right about the second time, and the third, and I assume she'll be right about every subsequent time in the way that someone who has been carrying something carefully for 400 years is usually right about the things they know. The broth still takes longer than I think it should. I still don't rush it. That's the whole story, I think, or as much of it as I know how to tell. The rest of it is still happening, still developing at the pace of careful things, slow things, things that are doing what they need to do underneath the surface before they become what they're going to be. Some things can't be rushed. The broth is one of them. Trust, it turns out, is another.